There are moments in history that feel like a fever dream, a time when the rules of gravity and of reason seem suspended. The 1920s in America was one such time. We call it the Roaring Twenties, an age of jazz, flappers, and boundless optimism. And at the heart of this roaring decade was a place of myth and magic: Wall Street. It wasn't just a financial market, it was described as the very engine room of the entire economy, its machinery running red hot, a spectacle that drew Americans to it like moths to a flame. From the factory worker in Detroit to the farmer in Kansas, everyone heard the siren song of easy money. The stock market, once the exclusive domain of the wealthy, was becoming a national pastime. It promised a one-way ticket to prosperity, a future that only went up. But this is not a story about charts and ticker tapes. It's a story about people, a handful of men who, in the absence of a strong central government, held the fate of the global economy in their hands. They were the masters of this new universe, titans of finance whose power was probably unsurpassed in history, second only perhaps to the U.S. president himself. This is the story of their breathtaking ascent, their fatal hubris, and the catastrophic fall that would plunge the world into a decade of darkness. This is the untold story of the Great Crash of 1929. To understand the crash, you must first understand the men who built the tower that fell. They were not a monolith. They were rivals, representing different philosophies of finance, all competing for the soul of American capitalism. First, there was the salesman, Charles E. Mitchell, the charismatic head of National City Bank, a forerunner to Citigroup. Nicknamed Sunshine Charlie, Mitchell was a new breed of banker. He believed that stocks weren't just for the elite, they were for everyone. His army of bond salesmen fanned out across the country, using high-pressure tactics to sell shares and securities to ordinary Americans, from school teachers to mechanics. At the time, his bank was America's biggest and one of its most go-getting. He made investing accessible, democratic even. But in doing so, he also brought millions of unsophisticated players to the most dangerous poker game in the world. In the opposite corner stood the old guard, embodied by Thomas W. Lamont, the managing partner at JPMorgan & Co. He was heir in all but name to the firm's founder, John Pierpont Morgan. Lamont was everything Mitchell was not: discreet, powerful, an insider's insider. He moved in the highest circles of global power, socializing with everyone from Charlie Chaplin to Mussolini. He was more of a financial diplomat than a banker, playing a key role in negotiating Germany's war reparations settlement. A delicate task felt better left to a banker than a head of state. To Lamont and the House of Morgan, finance was a gentleman's game, a matter of honor and stability, not a free-for-all for the masses. They saw Mitchell's democratization of the market with deep suspicion, viewing it as a reckless invitation to chaos. And then there was the predator, the lone wolf who played by his own rules, Jesse Livermore, the great bear of Wall Street. Livermore was not a banker. He was an infamous stock speculator, an early pioneer of what we would now call day trading. He operated outside the grand institutions, using his own capital and an almost supernatural intuition to bet against the market. He had made and lost several fortunes by 1929, a living symbol of the market's thrilling volatility. While Mitchell built the party and Lamont tried to keep it respectable, Livermore was waiting in the shadows, ready to bet on the moment it would all come crashing down. These three men, the salesman, the statesman, and the speculator, represented the forces pulling at the heart of the 1920s market. But what they all operated within was a system so unregulated, so rife with conflicts of interest, that it seems almost alien to us today. From our modern perspective, the Wall Street of the 1920s was the Wild West. Standard market practices of the time included activities that would land a trader in federal prison today. Insider dealing, off-market trading, it was all perfectly legal. The most potent tool for manipulation was the stock pool. A group of powerful financiers would band together in secret to buy up a particular stock, aggressively trading it among themselves to create the illusion of high activity and drive up the price. As the public, drawn in by the rising ticker, began to buy, the pool operators would quietly sell off their holdings at a massive profit, leaving ordinary investors holding worthless shares when the price inevitably collapsed. It was a license to print money, and it was business as usual. The lines between banks and corporations were dangerously blurred. The great banking houses didn't just underwrite stock offerings, their partners often sat on the boards of the companies whose stock they were selling. This created a quasi-collusive relationship, an undeniable conflict of interest that allowed them to control information and, by extension, the market itself. Financial analysis was in its infancy. In a world before the SEC and mandatory disclosures, rumors and tips were the currency of the realm. So much so that one of the most influential figures in stock picking was not an economist or an analyst, but an astrologer named Evangeline Adams. Titans of industry and finance would reportedly consult her before making major decisions. In a market running on pure belief, the stars in the sky seemed as reliable a guide as anything else. And fueling this entire speculative frenzy was a powerful new drug: debt. It was known as buying on margin. An investor could put down as little as 10% of a stock's price and borrow the other 90% from their broker. As long as the stock price went up, the profits were immense. But if the price fell, the broker would issue a margin call, demanding immediate repayment. If the investor couldn't pay, their shares were sold instantly, adding more selling pressure to a falling market. It was an architecture designed for collapse. This combination of easy credit, manipulative practices, and a culture of blind optimism created not just a bull market, but a bubble of historic proportions. Everyone seemed to be getting rich. Chauffeurs were trading stock tips with their millionaire passengers. Even Winston Churchill visiting the U.S. was swept up in the mania and became an extraordinarily unsuccessful stock market speculator. The market became detached from the real economy, from profits, from value. It was running on a single intoxicating fuel, the belief that tomorrow would always be better than today. And the titans of Wall Street were only too happy to keep the party going. The end did not come overnight. It came in a series of shuddering blows, a slow-motion catastrophe that unfolded in the autumn of 1929. The market had become jittery. After years of relentless climbing, it began to falter in September. But the true panic began on Thursday, October 24th. Black Thursday. The opening bell was met with a tidal wave of selling. The ticker tape, which printed stock prices, fell hopelessly behind, deepening the panic as investors had no idea how much they were losing. Margin calls went out by the thousands, triggering more forced selling. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange was a scene of pandemonium. At noon, a meeting was called at the offices of JPMorgan & Co. across the street from the exchange, in a scene reminiscent of the 1907 panic when J.P. Morgan himself had saved the financial system. Thomas Lamont gathered the heads of the other major banks. They decided to intervene. Richard Whitney, the vice president of the exchange, strode onto the floor and, in a theatrical display of confidence, began placing huge buy orders for blue-chip stocks like U.S. Steel, well above their current market price. The market rallied. The papers the next day declared the crisis averted, hailing the bankers as heroes. But it was a temporary illusion. The bankers' pool was no match for the tsunami of fear that had been unleashed. The following week, the selling resumed with even greater force. On Tuesday, October 29th, the floor fell out completely. Black Tuesday. It was the single most devastating day in the market's history. 16 million shares were traded, a record that would stand for nearly 40 years. Fortunes built over a decade were wiped out in a matter of hours. Stories, some apocryphal, spread of ruined investors leaping from skyscraper windows. One thing was certain: the great party on Wall Street was over. In the chaos, Jesse Livermore, the Great Bear, made a fortune, having shorted the market and bet on its collapse. He reportedly made over $100 million, the equivalent of billions today. For men like Charles Mitchell, it was a personal and professional disaster. He had famously declared just days before the crash that the industrial condition of the United States is fundamentally sound. His credibility and his bank were shattered. The era of the all-powerful financier, the masters of the universe who could command the markets with their will alone, had ended in spectacular failure. The power was about to shift dramatically and permanently from Wall Street to Washington. The crash was not a single event, but the trigger for a devastating economic avalanche. The panic moved from Wall Street to Main Street, sparking the Great Depression. As investors lost their savings, consumer spending evaporated. Businesses, unable to sell their goods or get credit, laid off workers by the millions. A banking crisis followed, as thousands of smaller banks, their reserves wiped out by bad loans and the crash, collapsed, taking their depositors' life savings with them. By 1933, nearly a quarter of the American workforce was unemployed. Bread lines snaked through city streets. The optimism of the Roaring Twenties had turned into a nightmare of despair. Public anger, simmering for years against the perceived greed of Wall Street, boiled over. The titans who were once celebrated as captains of industry were now reviled as public enemies. This public fury created the political will for a reckoning. With the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932, the federal government stepped into the void. The power pivot from private to public was swift and absolute. Roosevelt's New Deal promised to remake the American economy, and a key part of that was bringing Wall Street to heel. The instrument of this reckoning was a series of Senate hearings that began in 1932, led by a sharp and relentless New York prosecutor named Ferdinand Pecora. The Pecora trials became the greatest show in Washington. For over a year, Pecora put the titans of finance on the witness stand, grilling them under oath and exposing their practices to a shocked nation. He revealed the secret stock pools, the conflicts of interest, the massive bonuses bankers had paid themselves while their companies crumbled, and the tax evasion that was rampant among the elite. His most stunning revelation came from Charles Mitchell, the former Sunshine Charlie. Pecora forced Mitchell to admit that he had sold shares of his own bank's stock to his wife at a loss to avoid paying income tax. The man who had sold the dream of stock ownership to millions was exposed as a tax dodger. The public was outraged. Mitchell was indicted for tax evasion and his career was ruined. Even the patrician Thomas Lamont and the partners of JPMorgan were forced to testify and endure public humiliation. The Pecora trials stripped away the mystique of Wall Street, revealing a system that was not just flawed, but fundamentally rigged against the small investor. The revelations from these trials directly led to the largest regulatory ratchet in U.S. history. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 was passed, creating a firewall between commercial banking, which takes deposits, and investment banking, which speculates on securities. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, was created to insure depositors' savings, ending the plague of bank runs. And in 1934, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, was established to act as a permanent policeman for Wall Street, mandating transparency and outlawing the manipulative practices that had defined the 1920s. In the space of just a few years, the entire landscape of American finance was redrawn. The lawless, freewheeling world of Lamont, Mitchell, and Livermore was gone forever, replaced by a new era of regulation and government oversight. The Great Crash of 1929 was more than a financial crisis. It was a cultural trauma that reshaped America's relationship with money, power, and government. It taught a brutal lesson about the dangers of unchecked speculation and the fragility of a system built on pure belief. The regulations born from its ashes, the SEC, the FDIC, Glass-Steagall, became the bedrock of the American financial system for the rest of the 20th century, creating a period of relative stability. Many of those regulations have since been altered or repealed, and new, complex financial instruments have emerged that the architects of the New Deal could never have imagined. Today, as we navigate our own era of rapid technological change, meme stocks, and crypto speculation, the ghosts of 1929 still linger. The stories of the titans, the visionary salesman, the powerful statesman, and the ruthless speculator, serve as a timeless cautionary tale. They remind us that markets are driven not just by logic, but by human emotion, by greed, fear, and the intoxicating, dangerous dream of getting rich quick. And they leave us with a question that is as urgent today as it was nearly a century ago. Have we truly learned the lessons from the greatest crash in history? Or are we simply waiting for the next great party to end?